All right. Take two, crafting more resonant themes. If you saw the first 20 minutes of this yesterday, you can take a break right now because we are starting from the top. Welcome. My name is Sarah Shipp, and when it's not pandemic times, I'm a freelance theater technician. I've been designing board games for 2.5 years. I have 2 signed games, one that I'm hoping finds a home soon. And my approach to game design is really informed by my experiences with the theater arts world, and so a little more of an artsy approach than a mathy approach. So let's talk about making more resonant themes, resonance in games, and why that's important. I'm going to assume that you're pitching. Even if you're not pitching, then you will have, more control over the final product. But I really want to drive home the point that if you don't have control over the final product, then you can still make your themes more resonant, still think about these things, even if ultimately stuff gets changed or tweaked by developers or publishers or whatever. These are ideas, tips that will still help you. Another thing that I really want to drive home is that mechanics are not universally resonant. To hobbyist gamers, the idea of deck building meets worker placement might be like this idea that really jumps out in our minds and gets us excited. But even then, that's probably only a subset of hobby people that really feel that way. Resonance isn't really found there as much. That can be an aspect of it, but I think if we focus on themes, then we can really get the most mileage out of games that sound exciting and interesting, and I want to play that, Making more resonant themes is a great way to get noticed, either in the market, when you're kickstarting, on the shelves, or when you're pitching to publishers. It's also a great way to make you a better designer because it's going to make you more creative when you're thinking about your game themes in terms of resonance, because as we see, it will affect your component choices and mechanic choices. So let's briefly go over what a theme is, kind of how it's expressed in games, really. So your theme shows up in your illustration and your components, obviously. Components if they're shaped thematically, and illustrations if you have them. And obviously those things, if you're pitching, you won't have final control over, but it's still, you can design cards with the thought for illustrations could fit on them. You can suggest to publishers that it would be really cool if these components were shaped a certain way. Definitely one thing I like to do when I'm doing early prototypes is use standees and print out little pieces of cardstock that kind of give a suggestion of what the final components could be, but then I can recycle the standees for future prototypes. So that's a way that you can do it to give the publisher an idea of this is a theme that can be incorporated in the final product. But also there are other ways that the theme is expressed in your game. Evocative actions or mechanics is basically what I mean by that is instead of playing a card, you're buying a farm, or you're not placing a disc, you're building a building. So those sorts of where the mechanics are named after and described in a way that is thematic. Now, if you go too far with that, that can be confusing because, you aren't sure what's meant by launch your spaceship. And if that's not clear, then that's a problem. And we'll kind of touch on more of that too in the next hour. But, those sorts of actions, as opposed to draw back up your cards, that's not really thematic. But having thematic actions is a way theme is expressed. And then, of course, your scripted narrative, your flavor text, your rules text at the beginning, your hook, all of these are ways that theme can be expressed in your game, in your rule book, on your Kickstarter page. So what is resonance? A dictionary definition describes resonance as a tone with depth, shape, and clarity. That may at first not seem really relevant to board games, but if we look at the antonyms of those words, shallow, amorphous, muddy. Okay, I can see that a muddy theme is not going to be very resonant. An amorphous theme, it's not very what is it maybe? It's not a shallow theme, it's just pasted on. But we're starting to get an idea of what could be resonance. I think some other good synonyms for resonance are evocative, memorable, sticky. And sticky is interesting. I've been reading this book called Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath, and it describes ideas such as in marketing, in folk tales, in persuasive writing, that how ideas become more or less sticky, what bits of information get conveyed to people in ways that stick around and continue, and they really learned that thought. And not all of it's directly relatable to board games, but I think we get a good idea of what resonance is using their framework. So I'm not going to use all of their framework in the order they put it in, but to give you an idea of what their framework is, it's the acronym SUCCESS with the last S cut off. So it's simplicity, unexpectedness, concreteness, credibility, emotions, and stories. So I'm going to start with concreteness. And I really prefer the term familiarity for this when it comes to themes. I think that a large part of what creates familiarity is, a large part of what creates board games is familiarity. And I'm going to try this a third time and I'm going to get it right. A large part of what creates resonance in board games is familiarity. So what does that mean? The themes should be grounded in something that's recognizable to the players. One way that we see this is in the video game Untitled Goose Game, which exploded when it came out and was wildly popular for what it was. And why was that? It was very resonant. It was a very resonant theme because everyone's familiar with the idea that geese are jerks. That's a very concrete idea. It's something that people have experience with. And, it's not got these sort of weird higher order thinking things going on with it. It's just geese are jerks. And you're going to play a game where geese are jerks. That's great. So again, with the evocative actions I was talking about earlier, they should make players feel like they are performing the theme, not just playing a set of mechanics. One of the ways that I think that you can add a sense of familiarity to a game is with the tactility of components. I usually talk about the Everdell berries. Why are they squishy? Because berries are squishy. Berries should squish. That's why the berries are squishy. There's no other reason. But I think a better example might be metal coins. Metal coins are something that players like. Why? Because coins are supposed to be metal. And therefore, the game is better when the coins are metal. And so it's that sort of lining up your expectations with reality and having it reflect something that is true in the real world really helps make your game experience more resonant. I like to call these of course moments. This is something I came up with kind of recently, but why do berries squish? Because of course berries are squishy because they squish. Of course the coins should be metal, and we're going to come back to of course moments in some of the other categories of ways to create resonance. So the next, in the success framework, the next area I'm going to speak on is stories, and I'm going to break that out into story elements that you can add into your themes. Obviously, board games are very abstract. They don't have to have a complete narrative the way we think of like a novel or even a short story, but even a single sentence can convey a story. So there are ways to add bits of story elements into our game to make our themes more resonant. I'll start with plot, and what that means in board games that are abstracted. Plot is your game objective when it aligns with your sort of the theme, with the narrative objective, basically. So my favorite example of this is Sheriff of Nottingham. The game objective is to get these goods into your tableau so you can make the most money and win. Well, what is the character you're playing? What is their objective? Their objective is to do the same thing. And, you know, you're doing it by, your character is trying to sneak goods past the sheriff in order to make money. You're trying to lie to the sheriff in order to make money and sneak goods past. It is so perfectly aligned. And I think that's one of the reasons that game is so popular, is that it has that alignment that makes the mechanics and the plot make sense together. We can break that down into smaller bits where evocative actions further both the narrative and the gameplay. So I was talking about evocative actions before, but you know, if you're building a building, that should not just make your engine better in the game. It should also further whatever character or whatever your thematic goal is. It should further that goal too, in a way, in some way. So I really like Takedo as an example for resonant games. Takedo has, I think, 0 purely mechanical actions. Every time you move a space, your traveler is moving to a new location, and that location is a temple or a spa. Like, there's never a draw 4 cards type of action in that game. And I think that's one of the reasons that game was really popular when it came out, is it's very resonant and the gameplay makes sense. And yeah, I don't know where I was going with that. There's no and. Also with plot, and kind of going back to concreteness, familiarity, is that focusing on universal experiences really does help. Things that are comprehensible, things everyone has experienced, or enough people have experienced that it's sort of common knowledge stuff, can really help build that resonance in our themes. So the next story element is location. And location can be expressed in a number of different ways. Obviously, location can be expressed through illustration, which, as we've said before, if you're pitching a game you may not have final control over, but that is one way location can be expressed. But it can also be expressed through character movement. Again, Takedo is amazing because ultimately it is a line with some circles. Anybody can design a prototype of that map. That's not hard, but giving each space names and having the characters move in a way that is thematic. You know, they skip over the tourist spots that are too crowded and move to the ones that have fewer people at it. It has this sense of location, this journey that you're going on. And it's expressed very strongly in spite of the fact that it is not a traditional type of map on a game board. Another way location can be expressed is through game physics. So when I mean location, I don't just mean place in the world, which is obviously one way of thinking about it, but I also mean like being in a real space. So game physics in board games looks like, for instance, walking in Burano, where you cannot build a second story before there is a first story or a scaffolding to build on top of, because gravity. Because, again, of course you can't. Gravity exists. So elements like that, where you acknowledge real world physics in your game, even though you're playing 2D flat on the table, is still building that sort of sense of resonance, because it makes sense to the players. It helps when things make sense to the players, it helps lower the rules overhead. They're not going to need to be reminded of that rule, because that rule is an of course rule. Another way that location can be expressed, it is through components. And this kind of, you can, and also a combination of biofeedback, again, kind of tactility and players' physical movements. In this example, which is Sushi Roll, where it's a dice drafting game, but you're passing the sushi around on sushi conveyor belts. And I think those conveyor belts were one of the reasons that the game was popular, because we've seen sushi restaurants with conveyor belts before. So a sushi game that involves passing sushi around, the fact that they're on conveyor belts, of course they are. And that's great. And it's not pure conveyor belt movement, but you're pushing them around. And that's very resonant. And, those are pieces of cardboard, I think. I haven't actually held that game in my hands. So we're not talking about expensive additions to games. We're talking about thinking through our components, our rules, our actions in ways creatively that we can express our theme better. It doesn't require adding miniatures. It just requires about thinking creatively in these different ways to make the game feel more familiar, more grounded. So our next story element is time. I think that if you're not designing very specific games, this can get lost a lot. Time scale should align with the advancement of gameplay, and different scales produce different experiences. What does that mean? If you're playing a game that's expressed in epochs, so Civ games, the way that game feels, the speed those games play is different than if you're playing a real-time game. And then you've got sort of in between, where games that take place over seasons are going to produce different experiences, days. If each round is a day, it produces a different experience, a different set of expectations that the players have when they play the game. And then, when in history is the game set? Is that going to inform different component choices, different rules, that sort of thing, or just, names of resources? So there's a lot to unpack in that. I think that, the speed and the rhythm of your gameplay should really align with the time scale of your gameplay. And again, Takedo does this pretty well, because if the theme of the game is more or less a vacation, as you're traveling through Japan, then you have a sense before you play the game of, well, it's probably not a game that's set over years. It's probably more like weeks maybe. And then when you see the board and you learn the rules, you can count out the number of ends and go, okay, that's how long this story takes place. The last element of the last storytelling element that I'm going to cover is character. And character goals should align with game objectives. It's similar to plot, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same, because a lot of times we have individual player powers, or we have asymmetric goals and objectives. And the special powers should have thematic significance. In the vein of show don't tell in storytelling, characters, what they want, game objective wise, should be the foundation of who they are. So if they want to get more money than everyone else, that's your greedy character. And one thing that kind of drives me a little nuts is when I'm playing a game and the character card description says, this character is very, and then it's just a list of adjectives. And I'm like, why are they that way? That's not expressed in the art. That's not expressed in their game objectives. That's just a list of adjectives to try to force me to care more, but I don't, because I don't believe you. There's nothing that says that this character is this way. And to me, that's a real mismatch that doesn't make the game more resonant. That's just someone felt like they need to flesh out their character, but they didn't really understand how to do so effectively. I personally think that individual characters are more compelling than corporations, entities, faceless groups of meeples. So, I do like knowing who the characters are. I do like, knowing that they have names and that they have jobs and whatnot. But, I still want it rooted in something that is connected to the mechanics. And the really big thing for me is that if you really want to get resonance with your characters, focus on relationships. So it's sort of a thing I've been mulling over a lot lately, and I haven't had a chance to talk about a whole lot, so I might be tripping over myself a little bit, but relationships are going to make your story stronger. They're going to make your theme stronger, and they are underrepresented in board games. And I'm not talking about Fog of Love type games, although I've heard that game's amazing. Haven't played it yet. I'm talking about any kind of relationship. So two factions going to war against each other is not as resonant as two brothers who are estranged and building armies to one brother's trying to get revenge against the other brother. That's way more compelling. And honestly, it doesn't even necessarily change your game mechanics that much. You want it to be a little bit like justified, have maybe a mechanic that says this is why this theme is this way, but you don't have to do very much. And there's so many types of relationships. There's friendships, there's relatives, there's work relationships, mentor-student. Like there's so many different ways to explore this. Even strangers, acquaintances, finding ways to sort of fold that into our general thinking of characters in board games, I think would make more compelling board games. But there's another way to think about relationships, and that is the relationship between a character and the world. Not just other people, but the world setting. And going back to Everdell, I think that's one of the brilliant things in Everdell, is that all the buildings have characters that go with the buildings. Why does the post office need a postmaster? Because of course it does. And it makes those rules easy to remember. It makes the town feel more real, and I care about it more. I want my post office to have a postmaster. I didn't know I wanted that until I played the game, and then I really wanted it. And that creates an attachment to the game world. And I don't know if you know this, but you want your players to be attached to your game. You want that attachment. So we need more of this, please, basically. Obviously, Everdell has really great mechanics going for it too, so don't think that I'm saying that this is a substitute for good mechanics. And I'm definitely also like, take it as said that your mechanics should be good and they should be integrated with your theme. But moving along, the next category for tools to make resonance, I'm going to touch briefly on emotions in games. So we've already talked a little bit about universal experiences, but one reason those are so powerful is they can create emotions in players because it's something players understand. Relationships can create emotions in players. And then there's also emotional content. And this is something that I think it is a little bit artsy and it might turn some people off, but I'm telling you it's real. So one thing you can do that's really easy is just Google color theory summary if you're making simple prototypes to show to people, and if you have no idea about color at all, and figure out that, you know, yellow is cheery, and if I want to make a cheery game, maybe put a yellow border around the cards, and if I want to make a hopeful game, maybe put a light blue border around the cards, and that sort of thing, to just, you know, this is, again, if you're not publishing yourself, and you're wanting to just kind of give an idea of what the overall mood of the game is. I use lots of flood fills for card backgrounds just to say, this is the color palette of the world that this game is set in. You know, lots of pastels gives different feelings than lots of neon colors. Just, you know, an idea. You don't have to do that. There's plenty of other tips in here. You really don't have to use all these tips at once in your game. That might even be too much. But emotional content is present in color. It's also present in components, where you've got colors but also shapes. Pointy components feel different than curvy components. So thinking of like board games that have curvy boards, since I'm talking about Everdell, Everdell's board is not rectangular, and that gives it a more set in nature around a pond feel than, or next to a pond, than a rectangular board would have. Mechanics have emotional content, and some people have pushed back on me about this idea before, but they do. I promise they do. And the way I know that is that real-time games, even if they're basically themeless, feel different than a crunchy Euro. That is emotional content. It produces a different experience. Experiences are, you know, creating sets of emotions in players. That's basically what an experience is. And so every mechanic creates different emotional content, and that figuring out if those mechanics are creating the desired emotions or vice versa in your players is what playtesting is about. So I can't just tell you, because obviously mechanics synergize. But you know, there are certain, if you play enough games, if you play test your game enough, you can kind of know even before you add something into your game that whether or not it's probably going to give you the emotional content you're looking for. But since emotions is also kind of wrapped up in like telling stories and things like that, that's basically all I have to say about emotions. So unexpected. And up until now, we've basically been talking about very run-of-the-mill stories that maybe there's already 3, 6, 12 games about a theme, and another theme about this, that might not be that great. So here's this one. Actually, you do need, on top of all the 1 or 2 or 3 of the other tools that I'm talking about, you need to have an element of surprise or whimsy. You can flip tropes. But what you don't want to do is go into totally bizarre and unmoored, and that gets into sort of your amorphous theme territory, where unless you're really, really good at what you're doing, it's going to be harder. And even then, it's probably going to be more niche. I think about how some people are really big fans of Cosmic Frog, which is a bizarre theme. If you haven't heard of it, look it up. But if you're not really good at doing that, you're safer to stay in a familiar area, but adding a little bit of unexpectedness somehow. And a little bit is the important point, because, you know, totally weird is honestly not as resonant as a mundane idea that's got just a nice twist to it. So then the last point is simple. And this is also very, very important. I could have put this at the beginning, but I think it makes more sense to put it at the end. Because now that you've heard all these ideas, you really want to make your theme crunched down into a compact core, where your theme is your hook is one sentence. I know it's not the way it's described on BGG, but Tokaido's theme, the way most people say it, is that you're a Japanese tourist taking a vacation, traveling across Japan. And, you know, you're competing to have the best vacation or whatever. And what's great about that is it's one sentence. It gives you an idea of the theme, what happens in the game, and it's got the plot. You know, you're taking a vacation. It's got the character. You're a tourist. It's got the location. You're traveling across Japan. It's got the time scale, because you know it's not going to be super years-long game based on what you're hearing. And that is just really, really simple and compact, but it expresses what the game is about. And you want that for your theme as a way to describe your game. You also might want that in your game, but that I'm hesitating a little bit to say that you need to simplify the theme expression in your game, because I don't know how heavy your game is and all of that weird complications. So playtest. But really, if you're adding in thematic elements that don't fit well, that don't mesh well with what you already have, you might want to simplify. I would plead with you not to write too much fluff, lore fluff for your game. I think it's more powerful if the game's theme is expressed through gameplay. I will stand on this soapbox till my dying day. Your game's story is what happens from turn one until the last turn. The story is not what happens in the introductory paragraph in the rules. If that introductory paragraph in the rules doesn't look like what happens during gameplay, then it is a mismatch. It's extraneous. Your story is what happens while the players play the game. The introductory paragraph, my preference is that it's sort of like the Star Wars scrawl, where it's everything you need to know up until the first turn. It's an introduction. So a way to keep things simple and to not need a lot of extraneous stuff that doesn't really support the experience of playing your game is to leverage your mechanics to express your theme more fully, and to use your art and your components and everything to help strengthen your theme. But again, if you're pitching that you don't have ultimate control over that, but you can create a design space that says there's room here for all of that. And I'm open and interested in all of that. So I kind of skipped over the part where I was going to give an example game theme at the beginning, because I know some people might have run away to take a break since they already heard part of that. But I want you to think about this game theme and rate it on how resonant you think it is. It's a game called Inheritance, and you play as multiple generations of people in the 18th to 19th century. It's multiple generations, so it's a pretty broad span of time. And, they're head of household, so they're men in that time period, and you play one at a time. So you're a man with a job, building up wealth, and then eventually you die and you pass on wealth to the next generation who does the same thing, but he starts in a better place. And eventually one of your characters is going to become titled, and you're sort of moving up the ranks of the aristocracy and wealth, and the first player to become a duke wins. I want you to sort of rate that in your mind as how resonant you think that is. And I will give you a moment to sort of think about that. And then now I want to pitch another game theme to you, and I want you to think about the various elements we've just talked about. And I want to know if this game seems more resonant or less resonant. So this game is called Deadly Dowagers. It's set in the Victorian era, and it's about women. All the players play women who are middle class, lower middle class, maybe even, and they are ambitious for power and wealth. So they marry men, get in their wills, and then kill those men to marry richer, more powerful men. And the first player to become a duchess wins. And which one of those themes is more resonant? The reason I'm using this as an example is because this is actually my design process for a game I have signed, Deadly Dowagers, that started out as a game called Inheritance. And I was having problems with this theme because I didn't feel emotionally connected to multiple generations of people. The original conceit for the game design is I wanted to explore the ways the aristocracy became wealthy and powerful. And I didn't feel emotionally connected to it. And the mechanics were kind of, it was early in the game process. And so I was sitting there trying to think, well, how can you be one person maybe that inherits multiple times? And I was thinking, like games like Last Will, but that's just trying to get inheritance from one person, and further removed relatives dying and randomly leaving money it didn't seem very plausible. How does one person get in multiple wills? I suppose if you get married multiple times. But, if men getting married multiple times, they wouldn't get the titles of the women thing. But if it was a woman, oh, okay. And I had this light bulb moment of, that's fresh, that's different. You may not like the theme, but I would argue it's much more resonant. It's unexpected, for one thing. It's got the character, the plot elements, and the time scale is, the adult lifespan of one woman. And there's definitely emotions involved because we're talking about marriages and ending them in unpleasant ways. It also solved a lot of my mechanical problems, though, because suddenly when I have women doing nefarious things, I'm like, oh, okay, well, I need to sort of track how nefarious they are. So I had this infamy track, and now this game has this tension between how much money you're making and how much infamy you have. And that tension is really where the game is. So this is my real world example of a way that I used, this is before I sort of developed this and have been exploring this system of resonance, but this is how you can use this sort of thing to make your theme better and also make your game better. And again, this game got signed. It's hopefully going to be announced soon, this year sometime, I promise. So that's, I hope that I've made a good case for tweaking your theme, considering different elements that maybe to some people seem too artsy in order to make your games more exciting, more interesting, and that they'll be more successful, because I want that for your games. I want your games to be amazing. Now, if anybody has any questions, I will take those. I could also just start talking about random games and where I think they're resonant and where I think they're not. But that's basically everything I had for this panel. I think I went through the first 20 minutes in 15 minutes this go around. Let's see what the comments have to say. Okay, well, I know that a lot of people are going to be play testing right now, but that is what happens when the internet goes out on you when you were supposed to have your panel originally. So if you have any questions, you can type them in. But is there anything I missed? Because I can always go back and talk about stuff I missed. I think I covered everything. So if there's no questions, where you can find me, oh no, there is a question. What good methods do you use for coming up with a theme when your game is purely mechanical at this point? That is a good question. Oh, there is something I missed. And that is actually the answer to your questions. That's perfect. I have given this advice before and I stand by it. Find the movement is the answer. Now, what does that mean? How do the players move pieces around your board? Direction, speed, how are things moving? The movement in your game is where the heart of your theme is going to be. So it's hard for me to say without having very specific examples to pull from. And the only one I can think of is somebody else's game. I don't really want to talk about their game. They were trying to retheme it without their permission. But shape, movement, those are big ones. You know, how cutthroat and competitive it is can affect a theme. But I think really it's in the movement of how the pieces move around the board. I myself have had trouble with this. I've only designed one game that was purely mechanical, and I still haven't found a good theme for it because it was just too weird. But it was also a really kind of, I would describe it as highly experimental game, a real weird dexterity type game. And so it's not surprising that I haven't found a theme for it because it's hard to theme dexterity games. Yeah, I feel like I could give you better help if I was actually looking at a specific game, but definitely like play your game and then write down what it feels like. Like, does it feel fast? Not like, does the game play in 20 minutes, but does it feel fast? Does it feel slow? Does it feel contemplative? Does it feel lighthearted? And, you know, that's going to lead you closer to your theme. And then again, how the components move. Is it suggestive of a train barreling down the train tracks? Is it suggestive of combat or migration? Lots of weird nouns and things. Very applicable since my current game is 100% built around a weird movement system. Oh yeah, if it's built around a weird movement system, if you can't come up with anything, maybe your playtesters can. What I would include in all your playtesting sessions, what does this movement remind you of? And see if you can come up with some ideas and then maybe develop from there. Like definitely crowdsource for one thing. But yeah, absolutely. Movement is the, I think because, and I touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to talk about that more now, is biofeedback for me. And maybe that's not the best term. I'm struggling with the best term, but it includes sense of touch, but also like the way I move my body while I'm picking up components and moving things around. To me, that's an underappreciated element of game design. So tactility is a part of that, where, you know, what am I feeling when I touch the components? But it's also, you know, again, real-time games are frenetic because the short amount of time, but also because I'm moving stuff really fast. And this is a movement that's going to create an emotion in me. Passing things in a pick and pass drafting game, it has a sort of, it's got a flow to it it's this sort of repetitive movement that creates a different sort of emotional response. And again, all mechanics have that sort of thing, but not all mechanics include biofeedback because you're not necessarily, it doesn't have much of a rhythm or a movement. I would say that most times just placing a card directly down in front of you on the table isn't something you can really mine emotionally very much. So yeah, biofeedback is a tool that you can use to sort of focus the emotions of your game, for sure. And I don't know if there's any other questions that can remind me of other points that I forgot to talk about. That'd be great. But hey, I made it further into the hour, and that's exciting. And I don't want to keep people from playtesting too much. So if there's no more questions for real this time, you can find me at my blog, shipboardgames.blogspot.com, where I basically, all my posts are kind of like what I've been talking about here, not very mechanics heavy, mostly everything else heavy from a design standpoint, so not manufacturing or anything. And it's a lot of this kind of stuff. I've written about resonance twice already, and I'm going to write about the made to stick framework soon. If you are interested in connecting with me more directly, I don't have Twitter because I was addicted, so I got rid of it. But I'm in most all of the board game design forums on Facebook, so I'm around. I'm probably most active in Maple Syrup Shop Talk. I don't accept friend requests from people I don't know, sorry. If you want to know more about Deadly Dowagers, follow Sparkworks for news about that. I have my other signed game is in the Cats with Backpacks line, and that's a Facebook group that you can join, Cats with Backpacks. It's a that game is a flip and write game, but it's a unique twist on the flip part of flip and write. And yeah, that's me. That's everything. I hope that you all have a great great Sunday, rest of your Nun Pub, and that you have a successful time playtesting. And I hope that all of your themes become fantastic, exciting, resonant, evocative themes. Thanks so much, and have a great day.